Dakota Territory, late summer of 1883. From a distance, it looked like a wound in the prairie, a great rectangular pit, deeper than any man was tall, carved into the endless sea of grass. Day after day, a lone figure labored in that hole, her shovel a tiny rhythmic metronome against the vast silence. Her name was Alara Vance, a widow with 2 small children, and her neighbors had decided she was mad. They would watch from the edge of their own freshly plowed fields. They saw her hauling buckets of earth, her face smudged with dirt, her movements steady and tireless. She wasn't building a cabin. She was excavating a foundation for something else entirely, something no one had ever seen on this flat, windswept land. The hole just kept getting deeper. "She's digging her own grave," one farmer muttered to another at the trading post. The name stuck. Her unfinished home, this gaping hole in the ground, became known throughout the small settlement as Alara's grave. The children whispered it. The men laughed about it over lukewarm coffee. The women pitied her, certain her grief had unhinged her mind. But Alara Vance was not mad. She was remembering. She was building not from the flimsy carpentry manuals that had made their way west, but from a knowledge thousands of years old, carried in her memory from a windswept island across the sea. She was preparing for an enemy she knew was coming, an enemy more brutal than any wolf or bandit. She was preparing for the Dakota winter. What did this quiet widow, this object of ridicule, understand about the earth itself that every experienced frontiersman and carpenter had missed? What secret was she burying in the ground, and why would it change the way they all survived? To understand her methods, you must first understand the terror of the problem she was trying to solve. The northern prairie was a place of profound and violent extremes. The summers were a blast furnace, baking the soil into a cracked and dusty plate. But the winters were a different order of existence. They were a hostile elemental force. The cold did not simply arrive, it descended like a siege. It was a physical presence that found its way through every chink in a log wall, every crack around a window frame. It crept across the floorboards and settled deep into the bones. The settlers who had arrived with dreams of fertile soil found themselves in a desperate war against the temperature. Their cabins, the pride of their labor, became their prisons. These were structures built according to the wisdom of the forested East. Sturdy log walls, pitched roofs to shed snow. They looked robust. They felt permanent. But they were designed for a different kind of cold, a cold tempered by trees and hills. Out on the open prairie, with nothing to break the wind for 1,000 miles, these cabins were thermal sieves. The wind was the true enemy. It was a constant, keening predator that clawed at the walls, relentlessly stealing heat. A man could feed his stove until it glowed cherry red, and still the far wall of his one-room cabin would be coated in a fine, glittering layer of frost. A cup of water left on a table overnight would be a solid block of ice by morning. Ink froze in its wells. Potatoes stored in sacks on the floor turned to stone. Life contracted into a small circle of misery around the iron stove. Families would huddle together, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air before them. The daily rhythm was dictated by the insatiable appetite of the fire. The work was endless and exhausting. Felling trees, hauling the logs, bucking them into rounds, splitting them into quarters. A man's entire autumn was spent building a mountain of firewood. And then he watched that mountain vanish with terrifying speed. By January, the desperation was palpable. Men would stare at their dwindling woodpiles, doing the grim arithmetic of survival. How many weeks until the thaw? Could they make the fuel last? This wasn't a question of comfort. It was a question of life and death. When the firewood ran low, families began burning fence posts, then furniture, then the very planks pulled from their barn walls. The cold consumed everything. Alara Vance had seen this suffering in her first winter. She had watched her neighbors grow gaunt and gray-faced, their spirits worn down by the ceaseless losing battle. She had felt the same biting drafts in the small, poorly built shack she inhabited. But unlike them, she carried a different frame of reference. She was not from the gentle hills of Ohio or the forests of Pennsylvania. She had been born and raised on the Orkney Islands, off the northern coast of Scotland. It was a place of stone and wind, where trees were a rarity and shelter was not a matter of stacking logs. For 5,000 years, her ancestors had survived by going into the earth, not by building upon it. She remembered the ancient grass-covered mounds of Skara Brae, the Neolithic village that had been unearthed not long before she left. She remembered the crofters' stone houses, built low and dug into the hillsides, their turf roofs merging with the landscape. These were not primitive shelters. They were sophisticated thermal engines designed to harness the one constant source of warmth available, the earth itself. The prairie settlers saw the ground as a dead thing, a foundation upon which to build. Alara saw it as a living blanket. She knew that just a few feet below the surface, where the brutal winter air could not reach, the earth maintained a remarkably stable temperature. It held the memory of summer's heat long into the winter. While the air outside might plummet to 40 below zero, the deep earth remained a constant, life-sustaining 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This was her secret. This was the knowledge that drove her shovel into the soil while her neighbors laughed. She was not digging a grave. She was reaching for a gentle, inexhaustible furnace that lay just beneath her feet. The build began with the pit. She hired 2 young men from the settlement, paying them from her husband's meager savings, to help her with the initial excavation. They thought the job was strange, but they needed the work. They dug down 10 feet, far below the Dakota frost line, which could reach 6 feet deep in a hard winter. This depth was not arbitrary. It was the first critical element of her design. Next came the stone. While the other settlers built with the plentiful cottonwood from the river valleys, Alara had spent months gathering fieldstone. She used a simple stone boat, a type of sledge, pulled by her lone ox, to haul hundreds of heavy, rounded rocks to her plot of land. Her neighbors saw this as more evidence of her madness. Why go to the back-breaking trouble of hauling stone when wood was so much easier to work with? With the pit dug, she began to lay the walls. This was her own work, slow and meticulous. She was not a trained mason, but she understood the principles from her childhood. She laid a wide, deep foundation of the largest stones, then began building the walls up, fitting the stones together like a complex puzzle. She used a mortar made of clay and sand, a technique that was ancient and effective. 3 of the walls, the north, east, and west, rose directly from the floor of the pit. They were formidable structures, nearly 3 feet thick at the base. This thickness was the second key principle: thermal mass. Wood is a poor insulator, and it has very little thermal mass. It heats up quickly and cools down just as fast. Stone is the opposite. It is a dense, heavy material that takes a long time to change temperature. It acts like a thermal battery. It can absorb a tremendous amount of heat energy and then release it slowly and evenly over many hours. Her thick stone walls were designed to be a heat reservoir. As the stone walls reached ground level, the most peculiar part of the construction began. Instead of building up into the sky, she directed the hired men to begin pushing the excavated earth back against the finished walls. They built up a thick, sloping berm of soil, covering the stone completely on 3 sides. The north wall, which would face the most brutal winter winds, was buried under 8 feet of compacted earth. The east and west walls were similarly entombed. This was when the community's leading carpenter, Master Thorne, decided he had to intervene. Jacob Thorne was a respected man, the most experienced builder in the region. He had constructed the church, the trading post, and nearly a dozen of the finest homesteads. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man who believed in proven methods. He approached Alara's site one afternoon, his face a mask of professional concern. He watched for a long moment as she directed the placement of the earth against her stonework. He cleared his throat. "Mistress Vance," he began, his voice firm but not unkind. "I feel it is my duty to warn you. What you are doing here is unsound." Alara paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty glove. She simply looked at him, waiting. "That stone will weep," Thorne stated, pointing a thick finger at the wall. "It will draw moisture from the soil. In this damp, dark space, you'll have mildew and rot before the first snow. It is a recipe for sickness, especially for the children." "The stone will be dry," Alara replied, her voice quiet but steady. Thorne shook his head, frustrated by her calm. "And the weight. Woman, do you have any idea the pressure that earth will exert? When the spring thaw comes and this soil is saturated with water, it will crush your walls. I have seen root cellars collapse under half this load. You are building a death trap." "The walls are thick. They will hold," she said. "But why?" he asked, his voice rising in exasperation. "A house needs light. It needs air. You are building a tomb for your family. There is a right way to build a cabin, a way that has been proven." Alara turned from him and picked up her shovel. "I am trying to keep my family warm, Master Thorne." Her simple, unshakable confidence infuriated him. He left that day convinced the woman was a fool, and a dangerous one at that. His pronouncements at the trading post solidified public opinion. Alara's grave was no longer just a joke, it was a tragedy in the making. The community watched her now with a kind of morbid fascination, waiting for the inevitable collapse. The final elements of the design only confirmed their suspicions. The south wall was left completely exposed. Here she framed in large windows, using precious glass she had ordered at great expense. This seemed a spectacular folly. Why bury 3 walls only to expose the 4th with enormous heat-leaking panes of glass? The roof was the last straw. She laid thick timbers across the stone walls, covered them with a layer of tar paper, and then proceeded to haul load after load of soil up onto the roof, spreading it into a thick, living blanket. She planted it with the same prairie grasses that grew all around. By the time she was finished, her house had all but disappeared into the landscape. It was a low, green mound with a single, sun-facing wall of wood and glass. What they saw as a collection of bizarre, contradictory choices was, in fact, a single, integrated system, a machine for living. The earth berm was not just support, it was insulation of an almost infinite R-value. The wind could howl at 60 miles an hour over the top of the house, but it would never touch the walls. The brutal, sub-zero air would never have a chance to steal the heat stored within the stone. The exposed south-facing wall with its large windows was the engine's intake. In the winter, the sun hangs low in the southern sky. Its rays would stream through those windows at a direct angle all day long. The sunlight would fall upon the thick stone floor and the massive north wall, which was painted a dark color to maximize absorption. All day, that stone battery would drink in the free, radiant energy of the sun. Then, as night fell and the temperature plummeted, the thermal mass would begin its second job. It would slowly, gently release the stored heat back into the living space, keeping the temperature stable and comfortable for hours. The small wood stove in the center of the single, open room was not the primary heat source. It was a supplement to be used on the cloudiest days or to provide a quick boost of warmth in the morning. The house's main furnace was the sun, and its fuel was delivered from 93 million miles away, free of charge. The earth was its blanket, and the stone was its heart. By October, it was done. As the first cold winds of autumn began to scour the prairie, Alara Vance and her 2 children moved into their subterranean home. The laughter from the community faded, replaced by a grim, knowing silence. Now they would simply wait for winter to prove them right. Then December came. It arrived with a cold snap that was merely a prelude, a warning shot. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below zero and stayed there for a week. The wind was relentless. In the conventional log cabins, the battle began. Stoves were roaring 24 hours a day. The sound of axes splitting wood echoed across the frozen landscape from dawn till dusk. The true test, however, began on the 3rd week of January. Meteorologists would later call it the Great Blizzard of 1884, a storm system of unprecedented size and ferocity. It began not with snow, but with an astonishing drop in temperature. At dawn, the thermometer at the trading post read 5 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it was 10 below zero. By sunset, it had plunged to -25, and the wind was rising to a gale. This was a cold that felt different. It was sharp and predatory. It found its way through the thickest wool coats and burned the exposed skin. It was a cold that killed. For the settlers in their log cabins, the world shrank to a few feet of space around their stoves. The wind screamed through the log walls as if they were made of cheesecloth. The heat from the fires was sucked out as fast as it could be generated. Woodpiles that were supposed to last a month were vanishing in a week. Inside Jacob Thorne's cabin, the best-built cabin in the county, the situation was dire. Thorne, the master builder, had used every technique he knew. His logs were perfectly scribed. His chinking was thick and tight. Yet he was losing the war. He had moved his wife and 3 children into the smallest room, hanging blankets over the doorways to create a smaller space to heat. The stove was glowing a dull red, yet the temperature in the room hovered just above freezing. A rime of frost coated the nails on the interior walls. His wife was melting snow for drinking water because the pump in the kitchen had frozen solid. They were burning through their precious hardwood at a terrifying rate. Thorne felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. His expertise, his life's work, was failing. He had built the very best version of a flawed idea, and it wasn't enough. Through the second day of the blizzard, a thought gnawed at him. A persistent, troubling image of the widow Vance and her children sealed inside that earthen mound. He had predicted dampness, collapse, sickness. But in this alien cold, his predictions began to feel foolish. What if he had been wrong? What if her strange design was not folly, but a response to this very kind of existential threat? The thought became an obligation. He was the community leader. If a widow and her children were freezing to death in a failed experiment he had publicly condemned, he had a duty to help them. Or, at the very least, to bring them to a safer shelter, if any still existed. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned. He wrapped his face in wool until only his eyes were exposed. The journey was only half a mile, but it was a journey into a frozen hell. The wind hit him like a solid wall, stealing his breath and driving needle-sharp ice crystals into his skin. The snow was not falling. It was moving horizontally, a blinding white torrent that erased the world. He navigated by memory, stumbling from one landmark to the next, his beard freezing solid in minutes. After what felt like an hour, he found it, or rather, he nearly stumbled over it. Alara's home was just a smooth white dune in the swirling chaos, a single stovepipe poking out of the top, trailing a lazy, almost insolent plume of thin white smoke. There was no sign of distress, no frantic digging for snow-buried wood, just a profound and unnerving quiet. He pounded on the heavy wooden door, his gloved fist making a dull thud. For a moment, there was no answer. A spike of fear went through him. Had he been right after all? Were they already? The door swung open, and Jacob Thorne was hit by a physical force he could not comprehend. It was not a sound or a sight. It was a wave, a solid, palpable wave of warmth. It was moist, and it smelled of baking bread and dry wood. He stood there, stunned, his frozen mind struggling to process the sensory information. Alara Vance stood in the doorway, wearing a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Behind her, in the soft lamplight, he saw her two children playing on the stone floor with wooden blocks. They were in their bare feet. Bare feet. The detail shattered his reality. In his own home, a few hundred yards away, his children were huddled in coats and boots, their teeth chattering. Here, these children were barefoot on a stone floor in the middle of a historic blizzard. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the screaming wind. The sudden silence was as shocking as the warmth. The single large room was bathed in a gentle, steady heat. There was no frost on the walls. There was no condensation dripping from the ceiling. The air was fresh and clean. The large south-facing windows, which should have been sheets of ice, were perfectly clear, showing a swirling gray wall of snow outside. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his skin stinging as it began to thaw. He looked at the stove. It was a small cast-iron model, and the fire within was banked low, burning with a calm, steady pulse. It was not the raging inferno that was currently consuming his own woodpile. He glanced over at the woodbox next to it. It was nearly full. This was the moment that the foundation of his knowledge, the bedrock of his professional pride, began to crumble. He was an expert, a man of measurements and materials. He began to investigate, driven by a desperate need to understand what he was seeing. He walked to the north wall, the one buried under 8 feet of earth and facing the full fury of the storm. In his own cabin, this wall was a sheet of ice. He reached out and placed his bare hand flat against the cool, smooth stone. It was not warm, but more importantly, it was not cold. It felt neutral, like the air of a cool spring evening. There was no chill radiating from it. The stone had absorbed the stable temperature of the deep earth and was simply holding it, refusing to transmit the lethal cold from the outside world. He pressed his ear to it. He could hear nothing of the gale that was raging just a few feet away. He turned back to Alara, who was watching him with a quiet, patient expression. His voice was hoarse. What is the temperature in here?" She pointed to a small thermometer hanging on a wooden post. Thorn walked over to it. He squinted. The mercury stood at a steady, unbelievable 70 degrees Fahrenheit. He pulled his own trusted pocket thermometer from his coat. It was a frozen sliver. The mercury retreated deep into its bulb. It was useless. He trusted her thermometer. A 100-degree difference from the outside world. The final piece of data was the one that broke him. "The wood," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "How much wood have you burned since the storm began 2 days ago?" Alara considered for a moment. "The large basket by the door, I have filled it once, perhaps a quarter of what you might call a cord." A quarter of a cord. The number was a physical blow. Thorn had burned through a full cord already, and his family was still freezing. She was achieving this impossible comfort while using 1/4 of the fuel. The numbers were undeniable. They were brutal. They were absolute. He sank onto a wooden bench, the last of his professional arrogance draining away, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. He looked at this woman, this quiet widow the whole town had ridiculed. He looked at her warm, safe children. He looked at the simple, ingenious sanctuary she had built. He finally met her eyes. The words came out, heavy with the weight of his own foolish pride. "I was wrong," he said. The admission was clean, without caveat. "Everything I told you, everything I said to the others, it was all wrong." He took a deep breath. "This is not a grave," he said, looking around the bright, warm room. "This is the future. Will you teach me how it works?" When the great blizzard finally broke after 4 days, the landscape was transformed, and so was the community. The stories of suffering were everywhere, of lost livestock, of families who had burned everything they owned to stay alive. But a different story began to circulate, a story that started with Jacob Thorn. He did not just admit his error, he became a fervent evangelist. He took other men, the same men who had laughed at Alara's grave, on a pilgrimage to the low, sod-covered mound. He made them step inside. He made them feel the impossible warmth. He made them put their hands on the steady, neutral stone of the north wall. He showed them the modest woodpile. He explained the principles as Alara had explained them to him. He spoke of the earth as a blanket, not a foundation. He used her term, thermal mass. He explained how the sun, not the stove, was the primary furnace. He, the most respected builder, gave her all the credit, and in doing so, he lent his own hard-won credibility to her radical idea. The mockery died overnight. Alara's grave became Alara's method, and later simply the Earth Lodge. The name was spoken now with a tone of reverence. She had not just built a house, she had solved the central problem of their existence. That spring, no new log cabins were built in the settlement. Instead, 3 families, under the guidance of both Alara and a newly humbled Master Thorn, began digging. They excavated their own pits, hauled their own fieldstone. They adapted the design, some adding more rooms, others experimenting with different roof structures, but the core principles remained unchanged. Dig deep, build with mass, insulate with earth, and face the sun. Alara Vance never sought fame or recognition. She became a quiet teacher, sharing her knowledge freely with anyone who asked. She would walk them through her home, explaining the why behind every stone and every beam. She answered their questions with the same simple, direct practicality with which she had answered Thorn. The transformation of the community was not immediate, but it was profound. The following winters were still harsh, but the terror was gone. The new earth lodges consumed a fraction of the firewood, freeing the men from the tyranny of the woodpile. Families lived in a level of comfort they had never imagined possible. The constant gnawing fear of the cold was replaced by a sense of security and resilience. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or cords of wood saved. It was measured in the quiet moments of a winter's day. It was in children who no longer got sick from the damp chill. It was in a woman being able to bake bread without having the dough freeze on the counter. It was measured in human dignity, in the freedom to move about one's own home without being tethered to a stove. Alara's method had given them back their lives. The story of the widow who buried her house is a powerful reminder of how often true innovation is mistaken for madness. It illustrates that the most elegant solutions are frequently found not in new technologies, but in a deeper understanding of timeless principles. The arrogance of established wisdom often creates a blindness to ideas that lie just outside its accepted boundaries. Alara Vance looked at a frozen prairie and did not see an obstacle to be conquered, but a partner to be embraced. She understood that the greatest source of shelter was the very ground the others were trying to build on top of. The concepts she used, passive solar gain, thermal mass, and earth sheltering, are not relics of the past. Today, they are foundational principles of sustainable architecture and green design. Engineers and architects use these same ideas to create high-efficiency homes that require minimal energy to heat and cool. The quiet wisdom of a 19th-century widow on the Dakota prairie echoes in the most advanced buildings of the 21st century. It proves that sometimes the most forward-thinking solution is to look down, not up. Please be advised that this story is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles of thermal mass, passive solar design, and earth-sheltered construction are real and historically documented, the specific characters, names, and sequence of events depicted here are a narrative invention. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.